Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this York Festival of Ideas event, Reimagining Cartimandua, the original Queen Guinevere. My name is Laura Yeoman. I am an archivist at the Borthwick Institute for Archives here at the University of York, and I'm going to be your chair for this session. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Gillian Waters. Gillian trained as a medievalist and has been teaching and researching history for over 25 years. She's worked in the Royal Armouries Museum in Leeds, the Mansion House in York, the Council for British Archaeology, and many other local Yorkshire museums. Gillian teaches history and heritage courses at the University of York's Centre for Lifelong Learning. Today, Gillian will be exploring the love triangle that may have been the inspiration for the medieval Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot stories. So I will pass over to Gillian.
So yes, the story of Cartimandua, her husband Venutius, and her lover Vellocatus, I think, could actually be the inspiration for the story of Guinevere, Lancelot, and Arthur, a cracking love triangle that has come down through oral history before it was finally written down. And I'm going to start sharing my slides with you. And obviously, hopefully now you should be able to see the title screen, Reimagining Cartimandua, the original Queen Guinevere, which I think she is. The original Queen Guinevere actually in its original form, Guinevere, actually meant white ghost, the ghost perhaps of Cartimandua. Now, my first slide today is an image. I'm sorry, it's not a statue of Cartimandua. It's a statue of Boudica. Boudica is quite famous because she was queen by marriage of the Iceni in East Anglia, but she's not queen in her own right, which Cartimandua was in the north of England. Really, she ruled the land of the Brigantes. And I want to ask the question, where is the statue of Cartimandua? Because if I move on and you look at this side on the left, you can see the huge territory that the land of the Brigantes covered, the very name of the peoples that lived in the north of England. The Brigantes means the high ones. And over to the left here, you can see a statue of the goddess Brigantia. And Cartimandua, queen of this huge territory, including most of northern England, the whole of Yorkshire, Lancashire. Some say that the Carviti or the Stag people were also part of the federation of tribes that Cartimandua ruled, including areas in what we would now consider modern Scotland, in the lands of the Votadini up here. And the image of the goddess Brigantia that you can see on the right there is actually from Brigantes in Dumfriesshire in Scotland. Whether the territory that Cartimandua ruled extended into lowland Scotland as we would understand it today is debatable. However, her influence went far, and the goddess Brigantia is certainly celebrated in Dumfriesshire in the 1st century AD. So the federation that Brigantes ruled is a federation of different tribes. And on the map, you can see we've got the Latensi that eventually came, the peoples living near Leeds, the Satantai or the water dwellers around near the water in Lancashire, Mersey River. We've also got the Gabrantovikis or the goat dwellers living near Bridlington, as well as the Texta Verde, which again is probably, we don't really know what these names mean because they are Latinized from the original Celtic. So sometimes we are guessing, but with the name Brigantes, we are pretty certain that this meant the high ones, perhaps originating in the lands of the Pennines, the high hills in the centre of Britain. And it is probable too that the Parisii over in East Yorkshire may at one time have been part of the territories that Cartimandua ruled. She is queen in her own right, and she is recognized by the Romans. The only other queen to be recognized by the Romans is Cleopatra. And Cartimandua may well have been ruling the north of England at the time that the Romans invaded in 43 AD. And what I'm showing you now on the left is part of the Arch of Claudius, which is actually in a museum in Italy, on which there is a dedication to the Emperor Claudius, who actually conquered England or Britain in 43 AD. And the only bits of the text that we can read has been reconstructed to say the Senate and the people of Rome dedicated this arch to Tiberius Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, because he received into surrender 11 kings of the Britons, conquered without loss, and he first brought the barbarian peoples across the ocean, that's the British peoples, under the authority of the Roman people. It is thought by some that Cartimandua could be one of these 11 monarchs, or perhaps her husband Venutius, surrendering to Claudius. Others think that she became queen a couple of years later. But what is certain is that the land of the Brigantes was a client kingdom to the Romans, was allowed to remain independent as long as they paid tribute to the Romans in the form of slaves and other goods. And it is thought that perhaps this exporting of slaves from the land of the Brigantes, the north of England, to the Roman territories further south, may have caused dissent, disagreement between different factions within the land of the Brigantes, because it is, of course, made up of lots of different tribal groupings. And what we do know, although it's very sketchy, from the annals of Tacitus, is that round about 47 AD, the Brigantes revolt against the Roman occupation of Britain. On this map, which I've taken from Wikimedia, you can see the advance of the Romans with the yellow lines to this black line, which follows the River Trent for part of the period, part of its length, but is actually, this line shows the extent to which the Romans were prepared to occupy Britain at this time. They didn't want to overextend themselves. They didn't want to get too far into unknown territory. And they needed to maintain this border area. The land of the Brigantes up to the north of this area, around about up here, where I've just drawn a line, was really a bulwark for the Romans to help stabilize the northern part of that defensive frontier, if you like. However, it seems that perhaps in the southern part of the land of the Brigantes, which bordered on the Roman-occupied areas of Britain, that there were some disagreement about what should happen. Some factions would perhaps want to continue their alliance as a client kingdom with the Romans. Other factions would perhaps resent the fact that slaves and other goods from the land of the Brigantes were sent south to be exported to the continent and to Rome itself. And we're told by Tacitus that feuds broke out amongst the Brigantes, which compelled one of the Roman generals to return from his mission. He was actually trying to subdue some of the Silures, a Welsh group of peoples who were really trying to they were attacking over this border that the Romans were actually quite desperate to keep. And the Roman general that had been really on a mission of conquest of the Silures, so serious was the Brigantian revolt that he was forced to return back into Roman occupied land and really move against the Brigantes. We are told that the Brigantes beginning these hostilities, perhaps attacking over the border to the north into Roman occupied land, had been slain and the rest pardoned, and apparently they settled down quietly. A colony of a strong body of veterans was established at Camulodunum, which many people think is actually Colchester in Essex down here on the conquered lands, as a defence against the rebels and as a means of imbuing the allies with respect for our laws. It is possible that Tacitus is referring to the settlement at Colchester, which had become the capital of Roman Britain in this period, in the 1st century. However, it is also possible that he's referring to an area near Huddersfield and Halifax in Yorkshire, Castle Shore. It's possible that we're talking about Roman moves to build forts on into Brigantian land to consolidate their frontier. Some historians think that part of the cause of this revolt in 47 AD is perhaps Cartimandua building a huge fort in Stannick in northern Yorkshire. And the map I'm showing you at the moment shows you that we don't really know where Cartimandua was based, and there are lots of different possibilities. The green cross marks a spot where we have Castle Hill in Almondbury, which is a fantastic Iron Age hill fort, but doesn't have any occupation in the 1st century AD. It's also thought that round Barwick in Elmet, again, there's another set of earthworks underneath the Norman Motte and Bailey castle. But again, no definitive evidence that it's occupied at this particular point in time. Others have said that York itself, which is in purple on this map, may also have been a capital of Cartimandua. However, once again, there is no definitive proof. And the other area is Aldborough, which is in the Pennines. But again, although it was perhaps occupied previous to the Romans coming, again, there's no definitive evidence that it was occupied during this 1st century. And what you can see on this map is Stannick, where fortifications have been found and excavated last time in the 1980s, where evidence has been found of the Roman barracks and Roman goods there, and very expensive pottery as well, which all really leads to the conclusion that perhaps Cartimandua's capital was at Stannick. Perhaps it was actually built with slave labor from the localities, and perhaps worked as a center for distribution of traded goods coming in from the Romanized parts of Britain to be disseminated into the local populace as a form of patronage, as a form of really Cartimandua building her power base in the north. And it is thought that it was built on her family lands. But it is also thought that by building this fortification with the help of Roman engineers, with perhaps a Roman bodyguard based there as well, that this alienated her husband and other factions within the confederation of the Brigantes tribes, who resented slaves being sent south and resented the huge tax burden, basically, that we have with the building of this Romanized building at Stannick. It's a huge fort over many acres and would have taken quite some labour to build, and it is abandoned shortly after 69-70 AD, at the same time that Cartimandua is evacuated from Stanig. So we have a huge labour cost and great resentment building up, and it is thought that perhaps Venutius, the husband of Cartimandua, was actually becoming resentful of the position that Cartimandua was adopting with regard to the Romans. And one event in particular, in 51 AD, would perhaps have pushed him into rebellion. In 51 AD, Caractacus, who was a rebel leader, leading the Silures, or the southern Welsh Celtic tribal groupings, against the Romans, and really attacking this border that the Romans are so keen to build between themselves and along the line of the River Trent, really demarcating Roman land to the east or the right of the picture, and lands that are not part of the Roman Empire over to the west. Caractacus, great guerrilla fighter, is actually at this point fighting Didius Gallus, who is a Roman military leader, who defeats him in pitched battle in 51 AD. Caractacus then flees to the north. He flees for help from Queen Cartimandua. But we are told by Tacitus that Caractacus, seeking the protection of Cartimandua, queen of the Brigantes, was put in chains and delivered up to the conquerors. Cartimandua, we are told, ruled the Brigantes in virtue of her illustrious birth, and she strengthened her throne when, by the treacherous capture of King Caractacus, she was regarded as having given its chief distinction to the triumph of Claudius Caesar. Then followed wealth and the self-indulgence of prosperity. So Cartimandua then, I mean, what else could she do as a client queen? She would have to hand Caractacus over to the Romans, otherwise the Romans would invade Brigantia. After the capture of Caractacus, we're told by Tacitus, the Briton with the best knowledge of the art of war was Venutius. He doesn't call Venutius king. He only calls Cartimandua queen. She is queen in her own right. We're told that Venutius had long been loyal and had received the protection of the Roman arms during his married life with Queen Cartimandua. So he had been a great ally of Rome. However, she, Cartimandua, adroitly entrapped the brother and family connections of Venutius. Incensed at her act, well, you would be, wouldn't you? A powerful body of young and picked warriors invaded her kingdom. So we've got a split between Cartimandua and her husband Venutius, which has led to civil war in the land of the Brigantes. And it is to Roman help that Cartimandua turns round about 57 AD to try and get help. Tacitus tells us that the event had been foreseen by us, and the cohort sent to rescue fought a sharp engagement with dubious results at the outset, but a more cheerful conclusion. Cartimandua sends no help to Boudicca when Boudicca rebels in the early 60s. Perhaps she's more involved in trying to consolidate her power base in the land of the Brigantes. But what we do know is maybe 10 years later that Cartimandua actually splits from her husband. It may have been because on this map here, you can see it's got loads of Roman forts in, but the time that we're talking about, this blue line here at the bottom, just above Manchester, above Doncaster, and onto Winteringham by the River Humber, and over to the left there, Wilderspool by the Mersey estuary. What we have here is a line of forts that has been constructed by the Romans in Brigantian land, and certainly by 57 AD. And it seems that this area of southern Yorkshire, basically near just above Doncaster and up towards York, may well have been the area of influence of Cartimandua's husband, Venutius. And these forts may have been built to contain him. Cartimandua and Venutius then have fallen out, and certainly by 69 AD, we're told by Tacitus that, spurning her husband Venutius, she made Velicatus his armor bearer, the partner of her bed and throne. The power of her house was at once shaken to its base. On the one side of the husband were the affections of the people. On that of the adulterer, Cartimandua, the lust and savage temper of the queen. So says Tacitus, a Roman historian. And of course, the Romans really didn't like the idea of women in power. And yet Cartimandua had been recognized as queen. And rather than just taking a lover, what appears to be happening here is really political factions. Cartimandua is spurning one military captain, an alliance, Venutius, who's perhaps allied with the peoples living in the south of what is now Yorkshire. And she's taken up and made a different kind of political alliance with Velicatus, another military leader. However, Venutius, calling in aid from outside and at the same time aided by a revolt of the Brigantes, brought Cartimandua into an extremely dangerous position. She asked for some Roman troops, and our auxiliary infantry and cavalry contrived to rescue the queen from her peril. Venutius retained the kingdom, and we had war on our hands. We don't know where Cartimandua was evacuated to. It's highly probable that she was evacuated to Chester, and then from Chester, perhaps then along Roman roads down to maybe Colchester in Essex. We don't know. We have no evidence. But we have this love triangle between Velicatus, Venutius, and Cartimandua that leads to civil war and the destruction of a kingdom, which is very similar to the story of Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot. The Romans invade Yorkshire, or the land of the Brigantes, in 69 AD. They build a fort at York in 71 AD. And we are told that when, however, Vespasian, the Roman emperor, had restored unity to Britain, the enemy's hopes were crushed. That's the Brigantes. Petilius Cerealis, Roman leader, at once struck terror into their hearts, attacking the state of the Brigantes, which is said to be the most populous in the whole province. There were many battles, some by no means bloodless, and his conquests, or at least his wars, embraced a large part of the territory of the Brigantes. The conquest of the Brigantes began. And it's thought they had a two-pronged attack from Chester, which on this map is marked Diva, and then also from crossing the Humber at North Ferriby over to Malton, and then down to York, the fort which they established in 71 AD. Then these two armies marched north, but the two armies crisscrossed the Pennines, building temporary camps to subdue the Brigantes. They then moved further north to Scotland. However, the Brigantes as an entity appeared to survive within Roman Britain. Certainly by the 300s, we have one province of Roman Britain called Britannia Secunda, in which there was a duke or dux Britannia responsible to protect this northern area. However, 400 years of Roman occupation began to end in the late 300s. And we have a huge movement of people as water levels rise and it gets much colder. We have a lot of attacks from in the late 300s from the Picts, from Scotland. We have Saxon raids from the continent. We have the Scotti also attacking Ireland, from Ireland, Scotti from Ireland attacking Wales as well. And in amongst all of this, we have groups of people moving around Britain. Cunedda of the Manor Gododin, the area just above Lothian, just above Edinburgh today, is a Romano-Brit who's descended from Roman soldiers, who starts moving his troops, according to legend, from near Edinburgh right down to northern Wales and southern Wales as well. And he takes these stories of the north with him. The stories of Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius then mingle with stories of a dragon bearer. We have Sarmatian cavalry stationed, 5,500 troops stationed at Ribchester in Lancashire during the Roman occupation. They intermarried, they had children, and they originally came from the Ukraine, and they were known for having dragon banners or Draco. And these Draco, if you're holding one of these on horseback, the air will rush through the front and come out the end. And the clappers at the front will knock together and create an awful noise. They also had a tradition of worshipping swords in the stone, which you can see on the right there. And the stories of Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius intermix with stories of swords in stones. They intermix with dragon banners, and they intermix with a hero called Arthur, who probably is a northern hero. We know this because there is a battle fought round about the end of the 500s near Catterick, which was actually called Cartraith. And at the Battle of Catterick, there is a poem written called the Gododin that says he fed black ravens on the ramparts of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. Arthur has become already a legend. We're also given an idea of the contextual background to Arthur, because we're told that fierce Gulork of Elmet caused the great mortality of Cartraith or Catterick. Arthur is a product and probably died in civil wars during the Anglian occupation of the north. Both Arthur and Venutius actually found themselves in the middle of a civil war that is caused by an adulterous triangle. Now, these post-Roman kingdoms eventually the kingdom of Northumbria, the Anglo-Saxon or Anglian kingdom of Northumbria, which stretched as far as Lothian up to Abercorn, also round Dumfriesshire as well, and Whithorn, controlled the whole of what we now think of as Yorkshire, Lancashire, Durham, Northumberland. And many of the stories of the displaced peoples of the post-Roman, Romano-Celtic kingdoms moved to Gwynedd in North Wales with the stories of their peoples, half-remembered stories, Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius, that mingled with a story of an Arthur and a story of swords in stones. And it is in Wales that we get the first written stories of Arthur and Guinevere, or Guinevere, should I say. Not only do we get movement from Guinevere or Guinevere and these stories into Wales, we also have them migrating over to Armorica, otherwise known today as Brittany. And we also have these Celtic British peoples migrating over to Galicia in northern Spain, and they carry tales with them of Arthur. They carry tales of Cartimandua, Venutius, and Velicatus, but these stories have lost the names of the Roman peoples, the Queen Cartimandua, her husband Venutius, and her lover Velicatus. They've lost the names, and they have just become mingled into the story of Arthur with the sword in the stone. And in the Welsh tradition, we have something called triads, which are three-liners. They're actually an aid memoir to help people remember the stories that the bardic poets are going to tell of an evening around the fireside. And we have three that relate to Guinevere, wife of Arthur. We're told of three faithless wives of the island of Britain, and one was more faithless than those three, Guinevere, Arthur's wife. We are told of three unrestrained ravagings of the island of Britain. The first of them, when Medrawt came to Arthur's court at Kellywig in Cornwall, he left neither food nor drink in the court that he did not consume. And he dragged Guinevere from a royal chair, and he struck a blow upon her. The second unrestrained ravaging was when Arthur came to Medrawt's court. He left neither food nor drink in the court. So we've got a background here of civil war, just as we've had that civil war between Cartimandua and her husband Venutius, and the support from her lover Velicatus. And then we have the three harmful blows of the island of Britain. The second harmful blow, Guinevere struck upon Guinevere. And for that reason, the Battle of Camlan happened afterwards. And some of you may know that the Battle of Camlan is the battle in which Arthur, the great hero, finally falls. But in all these stories, the name Guinevere means white ghost. I think she is a reimagining of Cartimandua, an amalgamation of all these stories that are being put together in different forms in medieval France and medieval Britain. And perhaps the greatest storyteller of all is, of course, Geoffrey of Monmouth, who wrote a medieval blockbuster in the 1130s, which he talks about Arthur and Arthur's wife, Guanhumara. He tells us at length, when the whole country was reduced by Arthur to its ancient state, he took to wife Guanhumara, descended from a noble family of Romans, who in beauty surpassed all the women of the island. So we've got this Roman connection here. And I think this is the key to understanding the tales of Arthur and the love triangle there, that it really originates in the tales of Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius. We're told that Arthur had to go over to the continent to suppress, well, to conquer, actually, and give a bit of help to the Roman emperor who wasn't doing so well. Arthur, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, had committed the government of his kingdom to his nephew Mordred, very like Medrawt, and Queen Guanhumara. However, although Mordred and Guanhumara were supposed to be ruling Arthur's territories whilst he was off campaigning on the continent, we are told by Geoffrey that his nephew Mordred had, by tyrannical and treasonable practices, set the crown on his own head, and Queen Guanhumara, in violation of her first marriage, had wickedly married him. Again, this is the same tale we've had with Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius. We're told that the wicked traitor Mordred had drawn to his assistance the Scots, the Picts, the Irish, and pagans, but that Arthur put Mordred and his army to flight. And as soon as Queen Guanhumara heard this, she immediately, despairing of success, fled from York to the City of Legions, where she'd resolved to lead a chaste life among the nuns in the church of Julius the Martyr, and entered herself one of their order. So here we have this idea that Guanhumara, according to Geoffrey of Monmouth, is in York. Now, although Geoffrey of Monmouth he's known as a great storyteller, and he did make some things up, where's he got this detail from? Is it a figment of his imagination, or can we use this to prove that really the story of Arthur, Guanhumara, and Mordred is a story linked to the north that's been taken by bardic poets through oral history to Wales, and then to Brittany, and then to northern Spain, and only written down much, much later. It is, whilst Geoffrey of Monmouth is writing his story of a reimagined Arthur, we also have on the continent in France a certain Chrétien de Troyes, who first brings us the character of Lancelot of the Lake, who replaces the original Mordred as the lover of Queen Guinevere. We also have tales of the Knights of the Round Table. And in this illustration we're looking at now is actually Galahad going off on a grail quest and crossing a bridge with his follower. The story of Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius travels. And before even we get the story of Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale of Arthur, Guinevere, and Mordred, we have in Italy the Porta della Praceria at Modena Cathedral, built round about 1120, so before Geoffrey of Monmouth's blockbuster, The History of the Kings of Britain, was published in the 1130s. And in this illustration, you can see on the left there is Winlogie. However, that is actually Guinevere, another name for Guinevere. And on the right, we have Mordac or Marduk or Mordred, the forerunner of Lancelot. Is it true that the story of Cartimandua, Velicatus, and Venutius actually is the story that comes down to us by different names: Arthur, Guinevere, and Lancelot? And if you want to know more, I've been inspired in this talk by Michel Ziegler's article, Brigantia, which you can still find online. You can also find the original sources of Tacitus online at Warwick Classics Network. And you can also find out more on this website, Tacitus's Annals, as well. So thank you very much for listening. And I'm just going to stop sharing my slides with you now and hand back to Laura.
Thank you so much, Gillian. That was really, really fascinating. There's a huge amount of content in there, which is brilliant. We've got time to go to some questions. We've got a couple of questions ready to go, but if anybody has any more questions, please do just pop them in the question and answer box at the bottom of the screen, and we will work through them. So Gillian, your first question is, what do you think are the chances that Cartimandua and Boudica actually knew each other?
What a good question. I think they probably had heard of each other. They would have known each other. Boudica is around in the year, well, she rebels about the year 60, 61, 62 AD. They may have known each other. They may have had dinner together. I know not, but it could have happened.
And thank you for that. I've got a follow-up question about Boudica as well. Why do you think Boudica is the one that we know so much about? Boudica is the one with the statue. Why Boudica? Why not Cartimandua?
Yeah, Boudica is the one with the statue. And the reason that we know so much about Boudica is because of Tacitus, who is our main source of information. And the story of Boudica, the battle that Boudica fights along Watling Street, made a good tale for the Romans, whereas a story of a queen in her own right, when we have a very patriarchal society with the Romans, is not the kind of thing that the Romans want to hear about. So I think, there would have been more that Tacitus would have told us. He tells us very little. Actually, there would have been more that he could have told us. But I think because Tacitus's father-in-law is actually Agricola, who then goes on in the late 70s and early 80s into Scotland, and Tacitus wrote a book about his father-in-law's life, I think he really gets a bit sidetracked by that tale, which you can understand. He's trying to keep the father-in-law happy.
Brilliant. Slightly different question now. So have there been any creative interpretations, so novels or films or anything that you know of, about Cartimandua's life as Cartimandua? So rather than the Guinevere interpretation, have we had anything creatively about her that you're aware of?
Do you know, that's another really good question. Good question. And do you know, I'm not sure that I know of one. I do know that at the Royal Armouries, there was a interpretation put on from Cartimandua's perspective, because when I worked there, they did one on Boudica. And I said, well, why are you doing Boudica? Because the Royal Armouries is in Leeds. We have a queen here. Let's do Cartimandua. So they did do one on Cartimandua. But I'm not sure that I know of any others, no.
It's interesting, isn't it? Again, Boudica, not Cartimandua. Can we just check with you? Somebody is asking whether we can have the references in the chat. Can you share the information from your references, and we'll pass that out after the talk as well. So with the recording things, we'll pass that information out with the detailed references. We will
no problem.
That we will sort.
Yes, I can do that.
Thank you. We've also got somebody interested in the dragon bearers and the worship of swords in stones. So do you have any more kind of information about where you could point people to find out more about that?
I can certainly put that in the chat later on, and so you can
brilliant.
find out more about that.
That is fantastic. I'm also intrigued by that because that's a northeast of Scotland thing. I think it's what we would call a carnix, is what down here we'd call it dragon baiters and the dragon heads. So yeah, I might even know some information on that. Fantastic. Again, this is an interesting one. We've got a question from Rosa. Can you recommend a good book about Cartimandua? Has anybody actually written about her as a figure? Maybe it's that article in the references.
Yes, I think, yes, it's that article and then her references. Yeah. So Michelle Ziegler's article.
Brilliant. We will pop that out after the event. So Julie's asking, are there any other sources apart from Tacitus?
On Cartimandua, no. It's we don't have much else. He is our main source, which is it's absolute shame. We should have more, but we don't.
And I find it interesting too, because the one thing we have to bear in mind is we've only got the Roman interpretation of Cartimandua because the Brigantes weren't writing their own literature at the same time. So we're only ever seeing it one-sided, having to extrapolate from that, aren't we?
We are indeed, which is why we've got to unpick it and read between the lines and know that Tacitus's remarks about her being an adulterous and angry queen. Well, I'm sure she wasn't. She's just a powerful woman, and Tacitus doesn't take kindly to it.
So Chris would like to know, what are the chances that these connections, so I think the Cartimandua side and the Guinevere side, are purely circumstantial, just because royal infidelity and civil war are not particularly infrequent, which is something that I do agree with in this period.
Good.
No, I was just going to say, is that a possibility that it is circumstantial, although there's clearly a lot of evidence suggesting otherwise?
It is circumstantial, and it is an interpretation and a reimagining of Cartimandua, inspired by Michelle Ziegler's article. And I think a case can be made that the mixing up of all these stories then creates this Arthurian myth as we understand it later on. But you're quite right. It could be another pairing, another monarch and his wife and their lover.
Brilliant. Another really interesting question. We're getting a lot of really good questions today. So is there a link between Camulodunum and Camelot?
Another really good question. Yeah. No is the honest answer. That's there used to be it was Cadbury Castle or Cadbury Hill Fort down in the south of England that probably people talked in the 1980s about this perhaps being Camulodunum, but no, I don't think there is. I think Camulodunum, again, we've probably got two of them. We've got one in Essex. We've got another one near Castleshaw in the south of Yorkshire. But it could be that in popular memory that the name translates as Camelot. It could be.
Lovely. Oh, a difficult question from Hazel now. What ultimately happened to Cartimandua?
Well, I like to think that she was evacuated most probably westwards because, as we've seen, it was really unsettled conditions in the south of the land of the Brigantes, probably not to the north, although she may well have gone to the north of the land of the Brigantes into the land of the Picts. But I like to think that she went westwards, perhaps to a villa, perhaps near Gargrave, which is near Skipton in North Yorkshire, which is the most westerly villa that was found. I like to think that she perhaps went on summer holidays there, and perhaps that's where she retired. But I have absolutely no proof whatsoever, because our main source is Tacitus. It used to be thought that she perhaps was evacuated to Chester, where they built an elliptical building for her to live in. But our recent research has proved that that building was only built in 76 AD. So it's too late for Cartimandua to be evacuated there. But She may have lived there later on. We don't know. We don't know what happened to her.
Oh, it's unfortunate. She just disappears from the record, doesn't she?
Disappears. Yeah.
Oh, good question about Cartimandua and not Guinevere. Cartimandua and Cleopatra were both recognized by the Romans, but are there any other similarities between those two queens that we know of?
Very good question. Well, obviously there's the adultery, isn't there? Because Cleopatra has an affair with Julius Caesar and then with Antony. Well, I think, doesn't Julius Caesar die before Antony comes along? So we've not really got a love triangle, but we've got one woman and two men. They're both very, very strong rulers. We're not quite sure when Cartimandua came to power, but what she didn't marry her brother, I know that, which Cleopatra did. But again, two very strong women, both treated, certainly when they're written about by Roman historians, in the same way, as something that you don't really quite want, because in Roman society, you want your wife at home, looking after the slaves in the household. And these two women did not do that.
It's a really good question, that one. Another question about Tacitus. So Tacitus's texts are said to have come down to us via the copyist in Byzantium. Is there any sign that Tacitus's annals were known or read in Roman Britain?
That's another really good question. I have no evidence to suggest either one way or the other on that, whether Tacitus's annals were read in Britain. No, sorry about that.
There's also, Cliff has very kindly suggested, there is a book by Nikki Howarth Pollard about Cartimandua, although they've admitted they haven't read it. But there is a book, at least there is a book out there about Cartimandua, which might interest some people.
I'm so pleased to hear it.
Yeah.
That's brilliant.
So we've also got a question, which is about your research. So what will you do next to further bring Cartimandua's story to the broader recognition? And that's because one of the people in the webinar feels she's a more interesting figure than Boudica and deserving of more attention, which I think you would probably agree with.
As a northerner, yes, I would indeed. Yes. Cartimandua is on the throne for what, 26 years? And Boudica was never queen in her own right. So yes, she is a figure deserving of more study, I think. And there have been, I'm just thinking, some historians have written articles. Some of it are in the public domain, which we can put together for you later, and give you those things. What will I do? Well, this recording is going on the web, so it can be seen. So the story will get out there. But no, I'm not thinking of writing an article yet, because I can't prove definitively a lot of what I've said in my reimagining.
But don't worry, we'll make this available to the public and we'll push it as far as possible. I've got one question left in the question and answer just now. If anybody's, no, I don't, that's good. We've still got them coming in. So question from Elizabeth. Surely Cartimandua could have hidden Caraticus rather than turning him over.
Absolutely. She could have hidden him. And I think this is probably the last straw that turns her husband and his faction against her, because she hands him over. Now, if she had hidden him, however, the Romans may well have invaded, demanding to see him and to find him. So there's always that problem. And certainly, whatever trade goods she got from the Romans for being a very good client queen and providing them with slaves and other goods from the north of England, would have stopped. So I think Cartimandua is actually very, very dependent on Roman support for her position at this time, and that's why she hands him over. But it doesn't get her a good press. Doesn't get her a good press from Tacitus, nor from us, actually.
Well, that follows on very nicely to my next question, which is, what do you think is the significance of Tacitus focusing on the adultery of Cartimandua contributing to conflict? So is Tacitus writing to undermine her power as a female ruler, or is there something else going on here?
I think you're absolutely spot on there, that Tacitus is kind of undermining this whole idea that women could rule and women could be in power. And this is certainly in alignment with attitudes towards female rulers at the time. Anything else going on there? I'll have to have a big think about that one. That's a really good question.
I think that's all the questions we've got, and we're just about out of time as well. So I will bring things to a close. Thank you so much, Gillian, for your talk, for the questions as well. We've had a huge number of questions. It's been really great discussion too. So you've prompted a lot of thoughts, I think, in the minds of the audience. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you, Gillian, for speaking.
Thank you, and thank everybody.